So my name is Kelly Heber Dunning. I'm at MIT. It's a regional planning department. It's an old sort of naming convention. What we really do in the part of the department that I work in is sort of environmental policy and economics, so socio-ecological systems work. The title of my talk is the title of my dissertation. I look at ecosystem services, and I take an institutional approach to looking at ecosystem services. I'm assuming a sort of greater degree of familiarity in this room than I usually do whenever I give the talk. If I sort of breeze over anything today that you feel was shortchanged, just let me know. Okay, so why do this type of research? Well, I'm interested in, these linked systems that we have here, the tropical coastal seascape. We have them here in South Florida, sorry, I'm from South Florida. Usually when I give this talk, I have to sort of go through and explain these systems. And I do that because one time I was giving it at MIT and somebody said, what's a mangrove? So I'm gonna sort of spare you guys this because we in Florida know that these environments are super important to enable coastal settlements here. I'm really interested though in the human dimensions of the tropical coastal seascape, something that we call ecosystem services in my particular field and many of your fields here in the room. So these are, things ranging from the obvious fish that you take out of the sea as a fisherman to the crabs that you take from the mangroves to the tourism dollars that you earn on your boat, taking people out for sunset rides to wave attenuation, erosion protection, things like that. So a range of things that sort of begin with sort of very obvious things and sort of get into the more abstract realm, things that people kind of take for granted, and you see it here in South Florida too. People still take out mangroves. I mean, we just saw it happen a couple months back for that boat show, and people don't really realize that, without the mangroves, we can't really settle these coasts. So take that lack of understanding and multiply it, and it's still sort of, there's a big gap in Southeast Asia that's rapidly changing. My big research question, and I think again it really applies here in the state of Florida, I look at it through a development lens, is I'm really interested in types of policies, be they regional or national, and institutions, which are social arrangements for managing natural resources, that can prevent the degradation of the resources of the tropical coastal seascape. The picture there on the right is a dynamited staghorn coral stand from a village in Indonesia called Lovina. Dynamite's cheap. You can very easily, in 5 minutes, harvest some large pelagics like tuna that would otherwise take a whole day, and it costs you about $1 to do it. I would say that dynamiting, at least in the areas that I work in, is sort of phasing out. It's still a big problem in more remote places of Indonesia like Papua or Sulawesi. I wanted to sort of go through the main takeaways of my talk. I'm gonna try to limit myself to 15, 20 minutes. But I wanna sort of make the claim to you today and hopefully convince you that in developing context, often community-based management institutions help increase the level of benefits that we can derive from an ecosystem. I also make the argument that you need to look at both social and ecological data in order to make these types of claims, or else, at least in my strong opinion, I'm not necessarily very interested in the findings unless you sort of draw on both these realms. And I think you can look across ecologists and across social sciences, and I think this is increasingly the trend, but at the same time you can make some really solid criticisms that are discipline specific as to where us social scientists are falling down in this regard, or likewise ecologists are. And then I sort of want to present my findings in terms of 3 major concepts, so legitimacy, economic innovation, and adaptive problem solving. And I'm making the argument that where you see sort of community-based, localized approaches to resource management in high poverty, low income areas, you see increases in these 3 things. So how did I sort of investigate my research question? Well, I needed to first find a region in the world that was sort of rich in these tropical coastal environments. So not to compare, but, we in Florida have 3 different types of mangroves. In Indonesia and Malaysia, there's, it's in the range of several hundred, so it makes it really hard to sort of do these types of, whenever I've been out in the field doing identification, we can only get them down to the genus level because there's just so many. It's the same with corals. It's a factor of 10 in this region. So this is just a biodiversity hotspot, and this is sort of why I chose to cite the research there. In addition, the Science Impact Collaborative, which is my home lab at MIT, has a large grant with the Malaysian government right now to look at sort of linked social ecological systems in the region. So I picked 2 countries out. I mean, it would have been nice to pick all the countries that are included in the Coral Triangle, but alas, I am one person and just a mere PhD student. So the important thing about the Coral Triangle, though, is that all of the countries in the Coral Triangle are linked in a regional policy network. It's called the Coral Triangle Initiative. So you have sort of one concerted regional public policy around natural resource management, which is we want to stop coral degradation on the scale that it's occurring now, because if we don't stop it, it's going to be gone. But then you have implementation at the national and then, moving down the scale to the local level. They take very different approaches. So as a sort of, back at UF, I was a student of comparative politics, so I'm interested in drawing out comparisons between 2 different national level policies within a regional policy framework and sort of looking at the natural resource outcomes that result from these different policies. So I took Malaysia and Indonesia. Malaysia has a very top-down approach to the way that they manage natural resources, so everything emanates from the federal government. Indonesia, on the other hand, after the fall of the Suharto dictatorship in 1997, there was something called the Reformasi, which is complete reformation of this sort of colonial-type centralized government resource management, and it devolved it out to the provinces. So smaller islands like Bali in Indonesia, where my work is based, that's a province, but bigger islands like Java have like a bunch of different provinces. So a rough comparison would be like counties, but they're much more, they have much more authority and importance than counties do here in the States. So it's sort of hard to draw a comparison, a direct comparison there. I just sort of want to glaze over this. In order to define the analytic constructs in my experiment, I drew on sort of the well-known theory of common pool resources from Eleanor Ostrom and Aaron Agarwal. I won't belabor this too much, but I sort of want you to get a sense of where I drew my questions that will follow out of, and I just didn't draw them out of thin air. And, if you're interested in this, you can get in touch with me later, and I can sort of give you the nuts and bolts. But I also drew on, for establishing my independent variables, the literature of socio-ecological systems, where you get a lot of this resilience thinking and stuff like that. And as many of you know who are familiar with this literature, it's sort of, at this point, very, resilience can mean a lot of things and it can mean nothing, and sort of systematizing these definitions by drawing on published literature out there was very important in the early phases of developing the experiment. Where am I supposed to be pointing this? Okay. I want to back up a little bit and ask, why is this important in the first place? Why do we care about top-down versus bottom-up resource management policy? Why does it matter? Well, the answer to this question, and this sort of has to do a lot with the previous talk, is in international development organizations, multilateral banks, multilateral development institutions, over the past 20, 30 years, we've spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to implement community-based, bottom-up resource management things like we see in Indonesia, sort of localized resource management. A big criticism there are 2 main criticisms, and one is that in a country like Indonesia, with weak institutions that used to be under the rule of a dictator, you see the same sort of dictatorship era power networks in play. So even though Suharto isn't at the top, the people who are in the top, it's sort of the same old cast of characters. So even though it sounds nice in theory, in actuality, the same sort of inequalities and problems that you see with equity and access, especially among low-income people, these are sort of perpetuated even whenever things are devolved to local communities. So I wanted to produce empirical research that sort of said, well, is community-based resource management actually desirable? And sort of all policy researchers aim to make some type of normative claim. And sort of like I was saying in the beginning, you know, this is something that biophysical scientists tend to criticize from policy research is, you know, you need to be objective, but I think that, you know, we need to be able to make a normative claim about how we're spending money. So that's what I set out to do from the beginning. Okay, so, and then the things that I wanted to compare between the top-down management framework in Malaysia and the bottom-up management framework in Indonesia sort of centered on this notion of adaptive capacity. So this was, we sort of went through this in the first talk with the ball diagrams and the different steady states. So it's the ability of a social or an ecological system to withstand some type of unpredicted or unplanned disturbance and then sort of recover along qualitative indicators that we would like to see there. And often, you know, you need to be immersed in these stakeholder communities to know what's important to them. So in coral reef communities, it's the ability to have colorful fish around, to have beautiful corals that compel people to get on a plane from America or from the Netherlands or from France and spend a lot of money on a dive vacation. So if you have a bunch of coral that's had, you know, an anchor dragged across it, there's gonna be no dive industry in these communities. So this is sort of, you know, one final recap of my comparison, and I sort of threw in the bottom Y variable there, which is the, I'm looking to compare natural resource management policy institutions, and then I'm looking to compare it along the ecological outcomes, so the actual ecological health of the reef systems, but also the social and economic system health as well. So in order to sort of conceptualize adaptive capacity, I really looked at these 7 different independent variables that I compared across the Indonesian and the Malaysian paradigms. You know, again, I'm trying to keep this sort of short. So if you want to run through, if one of these is particularly interesting to you and you want to run through it at the end or one-on-one, great. But this is sort of ultimately how the experiment itself turned out. So I'm using a survey and I'm using qualitative interview data as well to compare along these 7 independent variables, and I'm looking at ecological outcomes as sort of, you know, a way to make these normative claims about like what policies tend to do better, what institutions tend to do better. And actually, like, you know, the proof is in the pudding, like the proof is in the coral reefs. So where did I do this work? This is Peninsular Malaysia. This work was funded by a US Fulbright grant, which in terms of like a grant that allows you ultimate flexibility to go and do international fieldwork, like I can't recommend it enough. I've had USAID funding in the past, and it's just been, you know, many, many strings attached. So if you have any sort of propensity to go out in the field and do international fieldwork, I highly recommend it. The Perhentian Islands, Tiamin Island, Pemutaran Lovina, and Ahmed. So 3 sites in Indonesia, 2 in Malaysia. The most important part of this experiment was in an intelligent way, and insofar as I could, was trying to control for possible confounding variables. So I needed to look at sites with reefs that have same development trajectories, and look at sites who have similar industry, similar income, similar per capita income. So I'm looking at 5 sites that depend on the dive industry and the tourism industry for their main source of income. I'm looking at sites that began to attract tourists in the late 80s and early 90s. I'm looking at 2 different forms of public policy that first began to be implemented in the late to mid 90s. So, you know, it wouldn't make sense to control, or it wouldn't make sense to look at a place where tourists started coming and diving on the reef in the 70s and compare it to a place that just started getting tourists in the past 10 years. So it took quite a while to sort of pick the field sites that made sense. My methodology is sort of tied back to the socio-ecological systems framework. I did a mix of surveys and interviews as well as ecological surveys on the reefs. And these were living coral cover ecological surveys. Just sort of a note on that. Sorry. So here are some of the stakeholders that I interviewed in surveys. These were heads of reef management institutions, reef management cooperatives. One is up there holding the sort of charter that all of the men who operate the boats and bring tourists out to see the reef use. He's elected, the guy's elected every year. These are more stakeholders. In some places I had to use enumerators. I speak Indonesian, but I don't speak Malaysian very well. It's a very similar language, but Malaysian is just very difficult for me. So these young girls who spoke very good English and very, native Malaysian were instrumental. I wanted to say a quick note on my ecological survey method. There are many ways to skin a cat when it comes to seeing whether or not a reef is healthy. Sort of things that you need to keep in mind are costs and personnel and things, obvious things like that. But for me, you need to tie it back to the industry as well. And I'm looking at places where the dive industry is everything. It's everyone's bread and butter. It's absolutely critical. Without the dive industry, these communities would shift back to an agrarian form of income. So I did living coral cover surveys, under the assumption that this was both a solid ecological and economic variable to look at. There are problems with it, definitely, but ultimately this is what I used. Here's a sort of example of one of my data frames. For each survey, I would have 160 of these slides that I had to go back through and analyze over the past year, so it's been a bit of staring at these for the past semester, so I'm glad to be wrapping that up. But the other thing that I did was use local knowledge in order to triangulate my findings on reef health. So if I went into a reef and found that living coral cover was at the 10% range, I'd say, that doesn't sound right, it sounds a bit low, let me just go and ask people. So I systematized a part of my survey in order to sort of double check my ecological survey work. And again, I'm one person. It wasn't the most ideal ecological methodology, but again, if you can sort of triangulate in a systematic way using local knowledge, I think a big flaw on the part of social science researchers is we don't triangulate in a systematic way. We only triangulate when we think things don't look right, and then that biases the data. So you have to ask everywhere and look at it for every field location. So I'm going to quickly, how is the time looking, Stan? How many more minutes you think? Sorry. Five? Minus 5 minutes? Okay, I'm wrapping it up. Okay, so these are my findings. I actually found that both in Indonesia and Malaysia, they had sort of the medium range of coral cover. This maybe is not interesting, but to me it was extremely interesting because Malaysia sees 48% of the visitors that Indonesian sites do. And if you've ever been diving in Southeast Asia or in the Caribbean, you've probably seen this, which is what I saw every day, all day. Like, seriously, it was this. Like, in Southeast Asia has a huge problem with certifying people in diving who can't swim. So a lot of time I saw what I would call reef crawlers who would just be like crawling along the reef. So whenever you see two sites, and they both have the same sort of qualitative metrics for coral reef cover, but you see half the stress on the reef at one site compared to another, it's very interesting. The question then becomes, why doesn't it look so much worse in Malaysia compared to, or why doesn't it look much, much worse in Indonesia compared to Malaysia? And the answer to that question I sort of found fell along 3 different themes. I'm going to skip ahead to the very last one since I think it fits the conference aims. So I asked hundreds and hundreds of stakeholders across these 5 villages questions in surveys and interviews having to do with their propensity to engage in adaptive problem solving. So I said, can you easily change what you're doing in order to protect the reef if you observe what you're currently doing is not working? And a really good example of this from one of the communities that I was working in was every year storms have really big waves and they take out mooring points. And in some places, like in Malaysian marine parks would come in and they would say, hey, our mooring point is gone, so everybody's throwing their anchor over and it's getting scraped across the reef and it looks terrible. And marine parks would be like, well, we can't do anything about it. Maybe you can do it, and dive shops don't have the capacity or the funding to do that, so it would just completely go unchanged year after year after year. And you would just hear this time and time again in Malaysia about any sort of example that you ask for, and you can see the difference in stakeholder responses in a place like Indonesia, where the village is actually in charge of managing the reef, compared to a place like Malaysia, where these marine parks are in charge of managing the reef. And I just saw this again and again and again. And another sort of thing that I wanted to mention was the ability of local stakeholders in these environments to feel like they could take things into their own hands, sort of both tied to ecological interventions as well as economic interventions. So in Indonesia, Hindu parts of Indonesia, these sort of polytheistic Hindu focused on the gods, they wanted to have this sort of temple garden in their reef. And they found that not only did it look beautiful to them, but it also increased the amount of tourists that they would see on their reefs. And it increased the interest in their reefs. So they sort of noticed that there was a greater demand for things like educational programs on what a reef is. And to us as Floridians, you know, that seems super obvious and intuitive, but the next great wave of tourism into these reef communities is Chinese and East Asian tourists who don't have the same sort of background that we do in a place like Florida over like, what is a reef? Can you touch it? Can you stomp on it? So those sorts of things. But to sort of wrap up here, I did find that whenever you give locals the ability to look after their own natural resources, and I wish I could have got sort of more deeply into my findings, there's so much greater potential to engage in adaptive problem solving, and there's just, it's like night and day in terms of adaptive capacity. One of the most memorable quotes I took away from the top-down marine parks Malaysian phenomenon was, you know, do you ever see marine parks officers? This was a question that I asked hundreds of people, and they were always like, you know, the only time I ever see them is when they come to the island and they ask for a free lunch. We never see them patrolling. We never see them doing education problems. They come for sandwiches. So I guess, you know, to leave you with one thought, it's a lot of us social scientists make the claim that, you know, a natural resource management institution can be a social success and an ecological failure. I'm making the argument that I do not agree with that. I think that's sort of a way to say, you know, there's all these normatively desirable things like deliberation and consensus in these institutions, but the reef still looks horrible. Well, we haven't solved the problem. And I think that only this sort of integrated thinking around socio-ecological systems can get us closer to solving that problem. So thanks for your time. Sorry for going over. Really appreciate it.
Okay, so here is an example of scale up, because what Kelly has done at a local village level in Indonesia, how can you take those same principles and apply it to collaborative work that could be done between Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, and Jacksonville? See where we're headed with that? And that is the data that the principles that she's outlined. Can it be used on a scale-up method, scaled-up method, so that you get collaboration for adaptation, adaptive capacity in a much larger scale among different social institutions like county governments, city governments, or whatever.